Um, give me just a second here to try to share something. Share. Oh, oh, I do have an artwork in the background. Oh, okay. Okay, it works. It's just that I don't see it. Adam wanted to know what the artwork is, and that is Caspar David Friedrich's, I forget what the title of the painting is. Oh,
Yeah, no free.
Damn, excuse me, never mind. It's not working.
Sorry, Justin. I've been admiring that for the last few hours. These lectures, like, what is that exactly?
Okay.
Sorry.
I don't know what that is. I'll have to ask the person I'm subletting from, and I'll also have to figure out how to do a proper background.
You're trying to use like kind of green screen effect and pop the image up behind you. Is that idea?
Yeah, but I don't know. Once I'm in a session, I don't know how to do a green screen. What do you see now? Here's another question. What do you see now? From
just see you as on the screen as a.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
My commands, if next to it says start video, like just turn video on and off.
Okay.
There's a small up arrow, a kind of up divot.
Mm-hmm.
And there, if I click on that, I can choose a virtual background.
Nah, I don't want to screw around with that. We have limited time. What's more important
Which Caspar David Friedrich did you want? Because I could use it as an image. I could bring it up for you.
It was a Caspar David Friedrich's. It's called like mountain scene or something like that.
You don't mean the Wanderer on the
Adam, let's try with let's worry
No,
about
everything's good.
Let's worry about aesthetics another time, okay? Because I'm recording now and I want to get started.
Hang on a second.
Yeah. Also, be sure to turn your mics off if you have them on, and you're not speaking, but you have, dogs and babies and so on. Please make sure that your mics are off. Or for example, if you're dragging a chair, or for example, if you are dragging a chair across the room, please make sure your mic is off. Okay? All right. I can still hear someone dragging something. That's not going to work. Okay? Make sure your mic is off. If there's any ambient noise, please. Okay. So, what do you see? That's what I would like you to know. Can you see the schedule that I'm projecting? Okay, good. Thank you so much. Welcome back, everybody. We've got a lot to do today, and I'm going to try to remain faithful to this schedule as much as I can. We've got a few minutes for administrative questions, which we're taking up with technical questions. Then we've got 10 to kind of go over some general Kant questions. Now, and I also wanted to tie off a few things we were discussing last time. And then today, there's a lot of reading for today. I think I overdid it. We've got, for that reason, 2 presentations. One from Whitney Shah, who's going to give us the first half of the reading, The Analytic of the Beautiful. And then I am going to follow up after Whitney's presentation, which I'm sure is going to be excellent. And it's not that I want to repeat anything that she will have said, but I have a lot that I think it's important for me also to cover about the Analytic of the Beautiful. Then by around 1:20, I'm estimating, we're going to have a second presentation from Ognian Kasabov, who is going to summarize the Analytic of the Sublime for us. And then we're going to have some general discussion of that. And it's unlikely that I am going to be able to do for the analytic of the sublime what I will have done for the analytic of the beautiful. That is the kind of supplementary presentation of the materials. So in that respect, Ognian will be more kind of on his own in the presentation of that material than I will be today. And maybe next week I will circle back and cover some of that. Please turn your microphones off. Jan, I think your microphone is on and it's making a huge explosive noise every time you drag a pencil or put down. Thank you. Now, I think now all mics are off. And again, if you have something to say, this is, okay, just a few very practical notes for people who are new. One thing I wanted to say was it's the spirit of this course in these exceptional circumstances that newcomers are always free to join. And you're also free to come and go. As you probably know, I'm putting these courses directly onto YouTube so that if you have to miss them, you can always just go and watch them later. That said, I greatly prefer to have some kind of critical mass of people here so that I'm not just speaking as a YouTuber, but rather as someone with a group of people. And that's part of the reason why I think it's important to have presentations, right? Part of the reason why I invite people to present the material as well as myself. I don't want to just give lectures. I don't want this to be a cours magistral. I want it to be a proper seminar, and also inviting you and encouraging you to speak at least at some point over the course of the seminar will make it more of a kind of participatory thing on both sides, both your side and my side, rather than, again, it being me speaking into the void. Now, I'm very sorry, but I have an email that I see from Whitney Shah, who is our presenter, who says that she is having trouble joining us. And so I'm going to have to cut out for a second and just sit here and email her the invitation. She seems not to have seen it. And that's why I got distracted a moment ago. Here it is. All right. Okay, so those technical matters aside, let's try to jump in. I really hope Whitney will have seen this because a lot is riding on her presentation in particular today. All right. You know, one of the things I was thinking about, obviously, we're trying not to talk about the state of the world when we do the seminar. The whole point is to screen out that world. That said, as I was reading these materials and I was reminded of Kant's kind of curiosity as a kind of avid reader of travel reports from the Canary Islands and New Holland, which is to say Australia, and all this stuff about parrots and seashells and so on. This all from a person who famously never left Königsberg. He was obviously allowed to leave his apartment, and he did. He went for daily walks, apparently generally on exactly the same itinerary day after day. Nonetheless, there's something kind of inspiring about this person who was himself, to some extent, quarantined, voluntarily quarantined, and yet who nonetheless kind of came to encompass the whole world and seems to have been very kind of clued in to that world in a way that we're trying to stay right now. And that he did without the internet. Of course, he was in a port city and he did see people getting off of ships from all over the world and talk to them. And that's part of how he knew so much. Anyhow, I thought that was inspiring. And as we'll see later on today, I want to talk about his interest, his anthropological / aesthetic interest in the kind of cultural diversity of the broader world far beyond Königsberg, including such things as the tattoo art of the Polynesians and other such things. That's one of my abiding interests in the third critique, is to understand Kant's broader political and anthropological interpretation of non-European cultures. So we'll get some of that material later on today, and I'll try to kind of integrate it into the general discussion as well. All right, let's see. How do I change? Okay, so this is the list of key terms that we hopefully mastered last time. Can you all see it? Nod your heads. Yes, okay. That we hopefully mastered last time. And if you didn't master them, you know, at least you have them now presented here, and you can go back and convince yourself that you have understood what they are. Generally, most of these terms are written in bold, both in the Geyer and Wood translation and in Kant's original. Whenever there's a key concept, he signals that it is key. By the end of today, I would also like to have mastered the concepts of the agreeable, the good, the beautiful, interest / disinterestedness, contemplative, and the sublime. This is kind of economizing given the limited time we have. There are other bold concepts in the reading for today, like inclination, favor, respect, that I'm not going to be able to cover. Perhaps Whitney will cover them in her presentation. And I'm going to be, as I've already acknowledged, even less thorough myself in the part on the sublime. But again, Ognian will cover a number of the important concepts there. All right, so this is kind of where we left off last time. And I'm going to have to, now when I'm projecting, I can't see chats. I don't know how to see what people are writing. And maybe it would be good for me to take a moment to figure that out, because I don't want it to be one or the other. Does anyone know? If so, turn your mic on and tell me. No? I see people shaking their heads. No? That's good. Let me go out of share screen. Okay, actually, I just saw what I wanted to see. Whitney is there, and that's the main reason I stopped share. Hi, Whitney. We're delighted to see you, and I'm glad you're there. Now let me go back to share screen. Okay, so here we are. This is what we arrive at the end of the long introduction. And if you have continued in the reading faithfully, you will have noticed that Kant lightens up a bit. the introduction, make sure your microphone is off to the person who just coughed, please. You will have noticed that there is a very, very kind of steep curb at entry, but then once we get to the analytic of the beautiful, Kant is using something closer to natural language, right? It's not so abstruse and hard to follow as the introduction was. So the reading for today should be something like an assurance to some of you who were kind of floored perhaps by the first reading, the introduction. And you'll notice also that there is a very kind of rigorous formal structure that begins with the analytic of the beautiful, where there are sequential sections. Those will go all the way through the end of the critique, all the way through the end of the critique of teleological judgment, up to a number that is quite high, up in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I forget the exact number of sections. And that's kind of, as we go along, that is going to be the principal way that we will have for discussing parts. We'll say, let's go back to section 4, or let's jump ahead to section 53. And those are, again, running throughout the whole work, that is then divided into 2 critiques that are then divided into various sections, which are usually usually called analytics. We'll explain why they're called analytics soon enough. But then sometimes within the successive sections within an analytic, you'll have other divisions. For example, in the analytic of the beautiful, we have 4 moments, and these are developing something. So at the end of each of the 4 moments in the analytic of the beautiful, we get another definition of what the beautiful is, right? And this is a fairly common 18th century German academic treatise convention, right? I've recently translated from 1734 an academic dissertation from the University of Halle that is totally kind of minor in many important, in the obvious respects. It's not a work that has previously been considered worthy of canonization, and it similarly has sections going from 1 to n, from beginning to end of the work, with then paragraphs, with then moments that run over a certain part of, or certain number of the sections, right? So we'll be using this terminology, primarily section, but also moment and division and so on. And it takes some getting used to, but in the end, it is for a reason. It's helpful to have this. All right, so I also wanted to signal, again, this is a part of the critique in the analytic of the beautiful, where Kant loosens up a bit. The examples that he gives are like little windows into the range of interests and preoccupations that Kant had. I love the example of the sparkling wine from the Canary Islands. That is, if someone takes a sip and says, "Ah, this sparkling wine of the Canaries is agreeable," And then his interlocutor jumps in and says, no, no, you should say, this sparkling wine from the Canaries is agreeable to me. Why? Well, because when we're talking about agreeableness rather than beauty, it is, so to speak, a case where every person is the measure. And that reveals quite a bit. It reveals that he was reading travel reports from the Canary Islands, and perhaps getting sparkling wine off of ships coming from the Canary Islands. So it's interesting. It's also, I think, interesting because this reveals this example, and maybe I should save this for later, for after Whitney's presentation, but let me just say a few words by way of kind of anticipation. This also reveals Kant's, so to speak, prejudices. And I mean this in a neutral way. I don't mean this in a judgmental way. Kant draws the line between judgments of taste and judgments of agreeableness in a way that excludes a good deal of varieties of experience, of aesthetic experience in the non-Kantian broad sense, from his consideration as aesthetically significant in the narrower sense. And I think this is interesting because there are a lot of contemporary philosophers today who, for example, are really interested in the philosophy of wine. I can think, for example, of my friend Barry Smith. For Kant, there can be no analysis of wine tasting that would have anything to do with his analysis of the judgment of taste, right? And that is because wine tasting, by definition, remains at this relatively uninteresting level of mere agreeableness, right? But this also then excludes all sorts of very complex cultural practices. You can think, for example, of a Japanese tea ceremony that is imbued with deep, complex layers of cultural meaning, but that for Kant would necessarily be some kind of combination of the mere kind of agreeableness that we have when we taste some sparkling wine from the Canaries, plus what he calls and develops at great length in the second critique, Sitten, or Sittlichkeit. It's hard to translate, something like morality, but morality in the sense of codified rules, right? So there's a wide range of cultural experiences that already in this very nice and clear tripartite division in the analytic of the beautiful, this division between the agreeable, the good, and the beautiful, that we narrow the scope of the analysis in an interesting and very clear way, but that we also get a kind of sense of Kant's own, maybe slightly judgmentally now, Kant's own narrowness, right? I'm not going to try personally, certainly not today, to define what is properly within the scope of aesthetics, right? I don't know if wine tasting should be part of aesthetics or not, or gastronomy, or Japanese tea ceremonies. I just think it is significant that, that Kant's prejudices come together with his analysis in order to define the scope of his investigation in such an interesting way. And this will also include, this will also exclude things like Polynesian tattooing for reasons that we'll see later on soon enough. All right, let me see here. How do I, okay, so Have I gone over? My goodness, I have gone over. Well, not really. I'd given myself until 12:30 to tie off lingering issues from previous sessions. And I think for the most part, I've already done that. I think, I tried to give you last time a fairly comprehensive, or at least adequate, summary of the key concepts from the first critique, less so from the second critique, even though that is important as well. If we wanted to rank the critiques in terms of importance for me personally, it would be third, then first, then second, so that I have the least to say about the second, even though all three are very important. I think one thing I perhaps didn't emphasize quite enough that I noticed will be important again in the reading for today is Kant's notion, as he develops it in the first critique, of the idea, of an idea. Now, idea is one of these terms that is misleading, perhaps, because it seems like such a commonplace term. It's a word that most of us use every single day, and we think we know what it means, and yet it is a term that has a long and complicated history in philosophy, going back to its Greek cognate eidos, and then the way it is analyzed in particular in earlier rationalist and empiricist philosophy, and Kant then, as is common for him, both taking up this complicated tradition of kind of distilled meaning within this what is also commonplace term, but is also using it in a very distinct and original way. What I wanted to emphasize, and this is all I'll have time for before we move on to Whitney's talk, is that ideas are not concepts for Kant. They're not given in the understanding. They are rather, again, the three examples of the transcendental ideas that we discussed last time: God, the soul, and the world. If we think about God as an idea, what that means is something very different from, say, I am, thinking of the idea of an apple right now. Locke would talk like that. Kant would not talk like that. For Kant to say that God is an idea is to say that you can't think about God in the way that you think about an apple. Why? Well, because it's part of God's being an idea that God somehow kind of floats outside of what can be given in the understanding and is not constitutive of the understanding in the way that an apple can be. And I wanted to signal this right now because several times throughout the Analytic of the Beautiful, Kant says things to the effect that beauty, in particular beauty, is a mere idea. Right? And this is to say that this will be part of Kant's analysis, and we'll return to this later on today. This is to say in part that for Kant, the beauty of a painting is not going to be discernible within that painting in the way that, say, the greenness of the painting, or the Virgin Mary of the painting, or the crucifix of the painting is discernible and given to the understanding, right? So when you see this peculiar phrase in Kant across the three critiques, mere idea, he's able to append that adjective mere to what is usually a commonplace word, because he's not using this word in a commonplace way, right? All right, it is exactly 12:30, so I'm right on schedule. And I wanted to, before going to Whitney's presentation, I wanted to just thank Whitney again for volunteering. Whitney is someone I've known for a while, since she showed up to audit one of my classes on I don't even on something in the
philosophy of science.
Yeah, something in the philosophy of science.
Biology.
Yeah, at the University of Paris, so I'm delighted to have a familiar person presenting some of this material, and we have bracketed 20 minutes for Whitney. And I'm gonna try to keep you within that time frame if you go over, but I'm very interested, as I'm sure everyone else is, in hearing what you have to say.
All right, thank you so much, Justin. First of all, I just wanted to say thanks so much for coming up with the idea for this seminar, because it's something that we probably all need a lot at this time to not think about more morbid things. So thank you for that. And also thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm very glad to be here, and sorry for being late, everybody. So also just one caveat before I start. I am not a Kant specialist at all. So if there are any out there who want to add anything to what I say, or to clarify, or to correct, you're completely free to speak up. And I will also try to look periodically through the chat to see if anybody has any comments or things they want to throw in. So yeah, feel free to do that. Okay, so this is something that we have, I think, like various people have brought up in the past few sessions, that especially in the introduction, but also in what we have read for today, there is just a whole like morass of keywords in Kant, and it's kind of hard to understand if you don't have like the background knowledge of them. So I found that to be true for myself as well. And so what I have found helpful in understanding him is trying to set up different distinctions and oppositions between the different ideas and keywords. So I don't think I can promise to address all of them that are relevant, but I will try to do as much as I can to try to make what we read today intelligible. So the main idea that I got from the reading for today, and also to tie it into what we've been discussing in past sessions, is that what we get from Kant in this critique and in past critiques is mostly an epistemological reading, in that it what he has to contribute relates to mainly to what kind of knowledge that we can have and how we know what we know. And in particular, one area or one sort of focus that he has is on like, what do we mean by a subject-object relationship, and how can we conceive of this? And one key term that we've brought up in past sessions is Kant's, well, I guess like we consider his main contribution to this relationship, which we call the Copernican revolution, Kant's Copernican revolution. And so what is important about this is that it kind of reconceives of the relationship between the subject and the object. So whereas the preceding tradition before Kant assumed that knowledge about objects resulted from passive receptivity on the part of the subject, with Kant, with his Copernican revolution, he proposed that there were innate structures within the subject that regulated perceptions about objects. So we no longer have a picture where it is only the object affecting the subject and the subject is kind of like passively kind of taking it all in, but there are, the subject actually plays a role in receiving perceptions and kind of constructing this relationship with the object. So, in this section, we kind of get an introduction to what Kant conceives of as the judgment of taste. And to understand what that means and to kind of get a full conception of it, I think we have to go back to what just plainly a judgment is. So I think in general, we can say in Kant that it's been said that a judgment is a presentation of a relation between two concepts. So for example, two famous kinds of judgments that you can get in Kant, and that Kant is famous for kind of clarifying, are analytic judgments. For example, all bachelors are unmarried. And this is a kind of judgment where the predicate is contained in the subject itself. So if in the definition of a bachelor, you have that this is an unmarried person. So this kind of judgment, an analytic judgment, needs no experience to be verified because it's contained in the definition itself. In opposition to that, you also have a synthetic judgment. And one example of that would be all bachelors are happy to be bachelors. One possible analytic or synthetic judgment. Don't know if this is actually true, but this would be an example. And this is in contrast to an analytic judgment because the predicate is not necessarily contained within the subject. So this would be a statement where you had to go out and have experience, maybe know a couple of very happy bachelors or know all very happy bachelors to be able to verify. So these are two kinds of examples to kind of like flesh out what we might mean by a judgment in Kant. So these would be examples of what Kant calls logical judgments. And they represent one way of that the knowing subject can relate to an object. So I bring this up because I think it's important to have this in the background when we go deeper into what Kant means by a judgment of taste and a judgment that is not necessarily a logical judgment. So at this point, I am going to read out a quote that I think is pretty emblematic of this section. So I'm on page 90 right now. So here Kant says, given representations in a judgment can be empirical, hence aesthetic. However, the judgment that is made by means of them is logical if in the judgment they are related to the object. Conversely, however, even if the given representations were to be rational but related in a judgment solely to the subject, its feeling, then they are to that extent always aesthetic. So I think that we can see here that Kant is setting up a distinction between what he has discussed in previous critiques and previous work. Between logical judgments and what he's going to introduce here, which are aesthetic judgments, which
Whitney,
are, yeah.
Can you tell us the section number for that if you have it?
Oh yeah, sure, sorry. So when I was taking notes, I only took down the page number, but let me try to look through and see what the...
If it's not convenient, don't worry, but...
Okay, no worries. Let me look through quickly, but if anyone wants to jump in, if they have it on hand,
yeah, it's in the first moment. I don't have it to hand myself.
Okay, so it's the one on page 90.
End of section 1 of first moment, but
oh yeah, there we go.
Yeah,
so right before the section 2. So I think it's the last sentence there.
Thanks, Dylan.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll make sure to be more precise with that in the future. So where was I? Okay, so so there is a distinction between that setup. So we can see right now that so aesthetic judgments are not necessarily going to be logical or work through concepts the way that the other judgments that he has discussed previously will be. And so that is all well and good, but I think that what Kant is concerned with now is there is a potential danger here in the definition of an aesthetic judgment, because how do we avoid a relapse into total idealism or total subjectivity in the aesthetic judgment? So I think, so what he goes into here is setting up other distinctions to make sure that he is as precise as possible in what this could mean. So here he introduces a key concept, which is pleasure or displeasure in the subject. So this is like what a lot of the judgment of taste is based on. And then he brings up 3 different ideas. There is the good, there is the agreeable, and there is the beautiful. So these 3 are all distinct, The agreeable is agreeable because it causes pleasure in the senses. And on page 93, don't have the correct section number, but it is on page 93.
Okay.
He brings up, for example, a dish that stimulates the sense through spices. So this would be an example of something that's agreeable. And something that is good, in contrast, is something that causes pleasure through concepts, because the subject must have an idea of, or maybe not, I shouldn't use the word idea, but a preconception of what the object is supposed to be.
Can I just jump in? I wanted to mention, I mean, this is a really good example of the kind of cultural specificity of Kant's kind of definition of these concepts via examples. He takes it for granted that spicy food is not good, as in that it is bad for you, even if it's agreeable. Now, obviously, in other cultural contexts, there would be a different kind of understanding of the relationship between the agreeable sensation of spicy food and its ultimate kind of ends or consequences. I just wanted to.
Oh yeah, but also I 110% agree. And also linking back to what you said about wine. Why is the example for agreeableness food? Why doesn't food fall into other categories?
Right.
So that, is obviously a very big sort of, as you said, like a prejudice in a neutral way of
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a very good point. So basically he sets up categories of the agreeable and the good. And beauty is distinct from those two. So what necessarily makes it different from those? So let me try to see where I am in my notes. So okay, so here I think it might be useful to bring up a sort of, I guess like a motto or a mantra that he has here. So he talks about subjective universality here. And I think it's through like what he talks about, it is kind of clear that what defines agreeableness, as Justin brought up earlier, is its subjectiveness. So if you judge something to be agreeable, you necessarily say that it has a validity, but you only know that it has validity for you as the subject. So, if you drink that wine and you find it very nice, you can say this wine is very tasty, but you don't know that for anybody else, and it's only for you. As for universality, that is something that is more associated with what is good or what we know through concepts, and that those judgments are more, or like tend more to be valid for a sort of universal set of people. So, but Kant, in combining these two, in saying that what is beautiful has to do with subjective universality, seems to be trying to operate a synthesis between these two ideas. So when he sets up the tripartite distinction between what is good and what is agreeable and what is beautiful, he seems to be taking kind of like one aspect of what is agreeable and one aspect of what is good, and trying to compare them and meld them together in what is beautiful. So, okay, so now I am going to try to go over a couple of concepts or a couple of ideas that were in this section, but I'm personally unsure about. So I will bring them up, and if anybody has ideas about them, or maybe we can discuss them and try to get to a clearer place about them as a group. So here we're getting into kind of technicalities on the judgment of taste. So in the vein of how does the judgment of taste actually work? So I'm going to quote from page 102 here. So if beauty results in a kind of pleasure on the part of the subject, we talked about it being based on the feelings of pleasure or displeasure. What kind of pleasure is it, and how do we kind of become conscious of it. So on page 102, Kant claims that it is the state of mind that is encountered in the relation of the powers of representation to each other, insofar as they relate a given representation to cognition in general. So maybe this is just because I don't have a huge Kantian background, but I'm not quite sure what this means, or what would be an example of this. So that would be something that I would be happy to know about if we can come to it as a group. But I'm just bringing this up as an example of what Kant thinks actually happens within the judgment of taste. So this special state of mind he calls free play because it is not restricted by particular concepts. So this means that there is a subjective correspondence of two faculties, the imagination and the understanding, and this is on page 104. So just bring this up, this is a little bit puzzling to me, so if anyone has any ideas, that would be great. And kind of to the last section that I want to talk about. So we talked a little bit last time about the idea of purposiveness and what it means for an object to be purposive. And so when it comes to a beautiful object and the idea of beauty, Kant is interested in quote unquote the mere form of purposiveness in the representation through which an object is given to us. And this is on page 106. So my question would be, what is a mere form? What does that mean? Why is it like an attenuated version of an actual form? And is this another attempt at a reconciliation of kind of two kind of extreme ideas, purpose and purposelessness? So he seems to be saying that the beautiful object does have a purpose, but it is not a purpose in the way that we traditionally understand it. So here, and this is on page 107, he says the purpose of it is to maintain the state of the representation of the mind and the occupation of the cognitive powers without a further aim. So so we see that in a sense, the beautiful object does have a purpose, but the only purpose seems to be to prolong the subject's contemplation of the beauty of the object. So in a sense, the beautiful object is an end in itself. So that is my reading of what he means by purposiveness without purpose. But again, this is a huge term in Kant, purposiveness. So hopefully we will be able to talk more about it later. So just moving on to the end of this. So just for some practical consequences for this that seem to also persist in contemporary aesthetics. What we can conclude from this, and what Kant concludes, is that judgments of taste are about individual objects and not necessarily classes of objects. So if you want to judge something beautiful, you cannot say that, all paintings are beautiful, but it has to come from an encounter with a specific individual painting. And also it must be made by, or the judgment of taste must be made by an individual subject. So you cannot take on someone else's judgment of taste. And you cannot imitate that. You have to encounter the object yourself to be able to make that judgment. And from these kinds of conclusions seems to come the further conclusion that there are no rules of taste. So it seems to be a completely singular encounter that happens between an individual subject and an individual object. So that is the end of my text-based commentary, but I think that they also, what I've said also raises a couple of questions for the seminar in general. So I just wanted to quickly, I know I'm coming up at the end of my time.
Don't worry.
So
go ahead. No, this is very interesting.
Okay, great. So my first question would be, so there seem to be two kind of formulae that we've encountered in Kant so far. So first is, we've talked about this too in previous sessions, purposiveness without purpose. and today we've come across subjective universality.
Mhm.
So, you know, these kinds, these two tend to be kind of formulae that we associate with Kant's analysis of the beautiful. So I was wondering, what is the relationship between the two? And, you know, is maybe one of them deducible from the other? So just formally, they seem to reflect Kant's tendency to try to harmonize or maybe reconcile two extremes or contradictory ideas, or alternatively, if he starts with one idea, to kind of bring out the inherent contradictions or paradoxes from them. So does this tendency tell us more about his work in general and what he's trying to do in this critique? And I guess second, it's interesting to think about like what kinds of examples Kant brings up when he talks about the beautiful or the agreeable or the good. And we've already had like a short discussion about, you know, the ways that he brings up food or drink and that kind of thing. And I think it's important to think about that because as we've mentioned, the term art or the term beauty or the term aesthetics has changed enormously from Kant's time to our own, in the sense that we nowadays tend to associate it with kind of institutionalized fine arts, but that's not necessarily the way that Kant or anybody within what we consider the history of aesthetics necessarily, the way that they necessarily conceive of it. So if we can, I guess, kind of home in on a couple of concrete examples that Kant uses to define each of the terms that he talks about. For example, with the wine or with something else, it would be helpful to us to think about what exactly he means by all these things and what kind of analogs they have in our time. So, yeah.
So interesting. Thank you, Whitney. One technical limitation here that maybe other people have an idea of how to solve. I don't know how we can really effectively applaud someone, but let's consider this particular moment when I see some thank yous pouring in the chats,
Yeah, I see
to be a sort of a sort of applause.
Okay, thank you. I see all of it.
In lieu of applause. That was really excellent, Whitney. And really, you honed in on really, I think, what the key problems in the analytic of the beautiful are. In particular, your identification of this pair of compound terms, subjective universality and purposeless purposiveness, which are, you're absolutely right, the two kind of best examples in the third critique of Kant's flirtation with oxymorons, right? What he's trying to do is precisely shove in the reader's face kind of compound of an adjective and a noun that don't belong together, right? And this is indeed his effort to harmonize opposites, or maybe better, synthesize opposites in order to discover and then illuminate previously kind of off the radar aspect of human cognition of it, or experience, right? So you absolutely identified the key notions here. Let's take a few minutes to see if there are questions for Whitney, because I think, you know, in what I'm going to say next will, in a sense, be a further fleshing out of what you've already said, a kind of supplementation or footnoting of your presentation. But I would really like to also invite input from others, either via chat or via mic. Anyone? This does feel like a classroom when you're saying anyone. No. Okay.
Oh, sorry, if people don't have any questions, there was just like one further point that I would like to add, but I guess like it's basically tangential.
Go ahead.
So anyone is interested in reading more about just like the aesthetic part of what we've discussed, I want to put in a plug for my personal favorite philosopher, Alexander Nehamas.
Oh yeah, sure.
So he's mostly known for being a Platonist, especially in the early parts of his career, but he has done a lot of work in contemporary aesthetics. So he has a very interesting reading of what we might consider the paradox of subjective universality. So in his words, if you find something to be beautiful, of course you have the expectation that this will be a kind of universal judgment, so that your taste in finding it beautiful will be reflected in everyone's taste. But he also mentions the point that if everybody did literally have your taste, if they liked the same movies, if they liked the same books, if they liked the same kind of paintings, you would be horrified by that. You would be horrified by the idea of a world where everybody was a clone of you in that way. So what you actually are seeking, like when you sort of exercise the judgment of taste in that way, is you're seeking to join a kind of community. So a limited group of people who you can discuss these ideas with and share these ideas with, but who are still delimited from the world at large. So it's an interesting way to kind of reconcile these two very polar opposites, or these kinds of extremes.
Yeah, I mean, that, I'd forgotten that you are a Nehamasian, and yeah, he does have a very nuanced and wonderful reading of this. I worry though that it represents the judgment of taste and the paired concept of the beautiful as something too much like an ideal. I say ideal in contrast with Kant on ideas, which I summarized earlier. An ideal in the sense of, we aspire to sharing our taste with our community. And even if this is in the end just a sort of as if, and last time I mentioned the philosophy of the as if, and I mentally underlined as I was reading The Analytic of the Beautiful a number of occasions on which Kant uses the phrase as ob, as if, but still, I worry that Nehamas's reading of the judgment of taste makes it out too much as an as if. And my own inclination in trying to understand Kant is to not give in to the as if reading. Do you see what I'm saying? To not, to try to find something, I don't want to say deeper, but something somewhat more satisfying than just the interpretation on which we aspire towards, and therefore to some extent behave as if our judgments were universal, even though they're merely subjective.
So if I understand you correctly, like you want or you're looking for a more sort of like grounded, concrete understanding of what it means to be universal, and not just, oh, this is a hype.
Okay. And in part, this is because I take it that if it were what Nehamas is describing, then there would be a possibility of Kant affirming that there could be some other community that is really into tattooing or tea ceremony that is kind of sharing in an experience that feels like subjective universality to them, and that is indeed good enough for them, right? Whereas, for better or worse, what I think Kant wants to do is to affirm the a real hierarchy that places the so-called emerging beaux-arts, the fine arts, at the pinnacle, and that places haberdashery and fashion and cooking, not to mention Polynesian tattooing and Japanese tea ceremonies, much further down, right? In terms of complexity and in terms of what's at issue. So if it were just a matter of finding your community of shared sensibility in a non-technical, non-Kantian sense, then a result of that could be a kind of communitarianism, or how should I put it, communitarian relativism, right? That would just let each community indulge in its own form of pleasures. But it's a fascinating discussion, and I don't mean to dismiss Nehamas's reading out of hand. I just mean to let's say get into a kind of productive dialogue. Maybe we can invite him to join us at a later point. I'm sure he's not traveling. Sorry, I see
there are
Johanna Weinant says she has a question about what I called Kant's flirtation with oxymoron. If we have time, it may be a slight tangent. No, we have time. Johanna, do you want to deepen that?
Yeah. So I'm struck by, on the one hand, Kant's conviction that, I think this is how Jacob put it last time in his presentation, that the world is set up in a system that can be cognized by our systematically sorting things. And on the other, this sort of strain of Kant's language. Right, and that's showing up in what you called the flirtation with oxymoron, but also just in the difficulty of the language, as we've also been discussing. So, I mean, I'm a professor of English, so whenever I see language straining or potentially failing, I'm interested in sort of the pressures that's being brought to bear there. My own philosophical background is a little bit more philosophy of language as well. And so what I'm wondering is about Kant. My question is really, although there might be another way to approach this, is about whether Kant has conviction in language itself to be able to handle the pressure that he's asking of it. And that, our minds might be set up to cognize systematically the system of nature and judgment, but is there a problem in the expression of it?
Oh yeah.
I'll
wow.
go back to it, but
that's so interesting. I don't think that's a tangent. That's not the right word. It's more like a massive gaping canyon to cross that I think is kind of what we're looking at over, one of our maybe structuring questions over the course of this whole seminar is whether he's bumping up against the limits of language. I mean, I would just say, I see Jacob wants to jump in and say something about this, but if I can just say something really quickly. One of the things I've learned from studying minor German academic dissertations of the 18th century is that Kant isn't actually as abstruse as we take him to be individually. He's just following conventions that we've forgotten about that look abstruse, right? And much of the difficulty level can be accounted for just by the fact that he is working in an idiom in a time and place, right? Now that's one point. Another point is, I think he is aware, he's certainly aware, and the critical project is centrally engaged with the problem of expressibility, and that is very much in play in the kind of shoving out of the domain of, let's say, positive claim making of the transcendental ideas, right? Or the kind of the analysis of antinomies in the first critique. There's a sharp awareness there that if you start carrying on about how God is like this or that, or the soul is like this or that, or the edge of the universe is precisely such and such distance away from the earth, or something like that, that you are going beyond the bounds of the sayable. And what philosophy ought to be doing is mapping out or limbing those bounds while kind of appreciating what lies beyond them. Absolutely. So that said, I don't think that Kant is being a kind of a paradox mongerer in the way that some mystically inclined philosophers have been, like Plotinus, for example. Is the one a being or isn't it? Plotinus, is running around in circles trying to confuse us intentionally, right? Kant is not trying to confuse us intentionally, and to the extent that he is sharing something paradox-like with us, it's because he's trying to innovate in language to say something that hasn't been said before. That's what I would say. I propose that we let Jacob jump in there very quickly. Also, Erica, the question about virtual art, that's fascinating. I propose, however, that we bracket it for a few sessions further on when we're able maybe to like take some time to draw some lessons for the contemporary moment from Kant's third critique. And that doesn't feel like something that's best suited for today. So Jacob, but thank you, Erica, for the question. Jacob, let's hear a little bit from you.
Yeah, I think this is very much, oh, sorry, am I still muted?
No, go ahead,
Oh, okay.
no.
Yeah, I think this is sort of in the same vein as what Justin was saying when he's saying that Kant is not a paradox monger, because one of the things that I think is really striking about the Analytic of the Beautiful is that it's one of these moments in Kant where he's finding sort of rigorous technical expression for things that are really very intuitive and commonsensical, at least insofar as our common sense and everyday life include an experience of art. Something like subjectively universal is an oxymoron, because if something is subjective, then it can't hold for all of us. If I say that's just subjective, I mean, well, that's your opinion, Justin. Don't foist it on all of us. So here we have something that is subjective. It's about the way I feel in this object. And I think Kant is very clear on that judgments of the beautiful, really, you're not really talking about the painting itself. Because the painting itself is, it's a bunch of pigment on cardboard or whatever. You're talking about the experience. And so here you have something that's about how you feel. It is subjective in that sense. And yet, we wouldn't just say, well, that's just subjective. That's just the way you feel, Justin. Because you take that experience and you think, everybody ought to feel this way. This is beautiful. Yeah. It's not just, my arbitrary preference or something. Yeah. So it's a paradox, it's an oxymoron, it's somehow contradictory. Certainly when you compare it to, so Kant is talking about the subjectively universal. Well, what would the objectively universal would be? We all need to believe this because that's the way it is in the objective world. It's raining outside. And if you disagree with me, go look. But of course you can't go look in me. At my, the feelings I have when I see this painting or this movie or hear this symphony or whatever. So it's subjectively universal. It's in me, and yet we're all supposed to share it. I can't point to a common world and say how we're. So it's very. I think one of the questions this goes to, though, and I'm babbling a little bit, but is how much in this what's a value in this is distinctively Kantian,
Yeah.
and how much of what's a value in this things that are sort of intuitive or that you could share without really entering into the Kantian framework. I mean,
Yeah.
The idea that it pleases without interest.
Yeah.
That there's certain kinds of pleasure where you say, I want to eat that, I want to drink that,
Yeah.
I want to make out with that person, and other kinds of pleasure where you just kind of have nothing to do but sit there with your pleasure. It doesn't sort of draw you into action. It's very intuitive.
Yeah.
What do we need? Okay, just sort of a question or a doubt. Something,
that's so interesting. But I mean, this is kind of like what they say about like Aristotle and the discovery of things. Where Aristotle discovered that there are things, and we're just like, well, of course he did. It's obvious.
Right.
But what some people would say in response is, it's obvious now,
yes.
right? Because Aristotle discovered them. And to some extent, I suspect that something similar is going on with what you say about the intuitive obviousness of this, right? And it's an absolutely vital question to ask. But what I would say in response is that there is this objective, or a presumption of objective universality of beauty that is crystal clear, I dare say, in a philosopher like Leibniz.
Absolutely, perfection.
Who just takes it for granted that beauty is of a pair with goodness or perfection, and that this is something that is secured by omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, right? So it's natural that all of these go together as long as you're still working in this non-critical, thoroughgoing, theologically anchored metaphysics, right? And nonetheless, it's perfectly plausible that Leibniz and his contemporaries also had this same kind of intuitive, non-technical grasp that you're alluding to, Jacob. So thank you for that. All right, man, there's a lot of stuff coming in, and I have like 8 minutes to give my little take on this massive amount of material that Whitney covered before we move on to Ognian's take on the analytic of the sublime. So if you would just allow me to not pursue the very interesting and valuable questions that are popping up in the chat in order to say a little bit more of what I feel absolutely has to be covered from the analytic of the beautiful today, I would be grateful for your understanding. Let me just highlight something that Whitney didn't emphasize so much that might be important for us as we go ahead, which is Kant on disinterestedness. This is something that Whitney did allude to, but I wanted to go back over it and highlight how important it is. Kant thinks, and let me see if I can share this. Share full screen. Okay, so this is from section 2. It is readily seen that it is readily seen that it is, and now I'm okay. It is readily seen that to say that it is beautiful and to prove that I have taste, what matters is what I make of the representation in myself, not how I depend on the existence of the object, right? And this contrasts with Kant's analysis of the agreeable and of the good in a way that might not be intuitively obvious, but I guess his idea is that if you drink sparkling Canarian wine, it is agreeable to you, and it's part of that judgment of agreeableness that you find it just obviously kind of definitionally preferable that there be more of the stuff, right? Right. If you like the sparkling Canarian wine, then you not only like it, but you also want that it should exist, right? And mutatis mutandis also for the good, right? If you judge that something is good, then you judge, among other things, that it should exist, right? Now, this is not the case with the beautiful, right? Where your judgment doesn't depend on the existence of the object. Now, you might separately want that thing to exist, but that separate wanting that it exists is not part of the judgment of the beautiful itself, right? And this is interesting. It calls to mind some material from the first critique that maybe I'm just riffing here. Maybe this is too loose a connection, but I can't fail to think here of Kant's critique of the ontological argument for the existence of God, right? Where, among other things, we establish that that the ontological argument doesn't work because, as he puts it, existence is not a predicate. That is to say that, you know, if you say I really want $100, you don't have to add I really want 100 existent bucks, right? That there's no kind of no further information added in in the kind of appending of the predicate of existence to your money or your dog or your spouse or anything like that, right? And so there are contexts for Kant. We've seen one in the Critique of the Ontological Argument, and we're seeing one here, where as it were, existence adds nothing. And I just wanted to signal that as something that might help you work your way into Kant's argument for the disinterestedness of judgments of taste, again, in contrast with judgments of agreeableness or goodness. So again, yeah, this comes in the following section 3, satisfaction in the agreeable is combined with interest. It excites a desire for more objects of the same sort, right? Another glass of sparkling Canarian wine, for example. Satisfaction in the good is also combined with interest for obvious reasons, right? Almost by definition, right? Like you say, you know, this is I mean, he distinguishes between good in itself and good for something, right? So what's good for something, for example, is a medium or a tool. This is a good hammer, for example. Obviously, to judge something a good hammer is to judge it in view of some end, which is inherently interested as opposed to disinterested. That's just kind of by definition. The good pleases like the agreeable does, Kant says, but always in a way that involves the concept of an end. So we're seeing, like, you know, a kind of Venn diagram should be popping up in your mind in the way these circles of the good, the agreeable, and the beautiful partially overlap. This is significant. This comes from section 5. The agreeable is valid for animals and humans, right? Obviously, your dog is perfectly capable of, I don't want to say judging, but of cognizing, I say that in a non-technical way, the goodness of its bowl of food. The agreeableness of its bowl of food. By contrast, at the other extreme, the good is valid for all rational beings, but not animals. The beautiful in the middle is valid for humans qua animal, that is, insofar as they are animals, but also insofar as they are rational beings, right? You might be wondering, what other rational beings does Kant have in mind here? The answer that we need not go into is extraterrestrials, right? And that's kind of a posit. There's very interesting scholarship on this. I can think of Dominique Perler, for example, who has written on the way angels from the kind of high medieval philosophy into the late medieval and scholastic periods become kind of decreasingly theological as entities, have less and less to do with scripture and the lore of religion, and more to do with kind of a conceptual thought experiment sort of role. So that by the time, Leibniz, for example, is writing about what the mind of an angel is like, this is just because he needs that kind of conceptual posit, right? Now, there's a moment, it's hard to say when exactly it happens, 1740, let's say, when angels get switched out for aliens, right? But you still need them in order to have some kind of idea of a rational being that nonetheless is not subject to the conditioning that our faculty of sense that we share with the animals kind of brings about on our own condition as rational beings, right? We're rational beings, but we're also something else. We need something that's just rational. I say that kind of as a tangent, but I think it's really important as an example of how Kant is beholden to the tradition. And of course, medieval philosophy is filled with reflections on, what's going through your dog's head when it's enjoying its food, for example, how that's possible without conceptual thought. All right, so I'm kind of running out of time for myself. Someone might want to check their mic. I hear some weird mic activity. So let me see if I had anything else. Okay, maybe, well, at some point I wanted to come back to section 9, which Kant himself explicitly says is the key to the whole critique of taste. The fact that the pleasure in the judgment of taste is something that follows the judgment of its universal validity is what Kant thinks is a sort of proof that that our judgments of taste are something other than mere kind of reports on the pleasure we're experiencing. And that is, again, something I'm just going to flag. I'm going to tell you to take it seriously when Kant says that this is the key to the whole critique of taste. Now, in the interest of time, I am going to look at my schedule, and make sure I didn't leave anything out, forgot. No, indeed, I have 1:20 to 1:40 for Ognjan's presentation. So I want to move on to that pretty quickly. Let me just say that this is something of an abrupt shift. We're moving from the beautiful to the sublime, which is something which is a profound movement. I wanted the background image that I wanted to have behind me today, but I failed to do it right, was a mountain scene from Caspar David Friedrich in order to get us into the kind of sublime vibe. So just imagine one of those. Let me briefly introduce Ognjan. He's someone I have interacted with for years on the internet. of whose existence I've been aware for years. Ognian is writing from Bulgaria and always has very interesting comments on things that I've written online. And so I'm really delighted to finally be interacting in a somewhat more vital way here. So he's going to summarize the analytic of the Sublime for us. And then I'm going to make some quick concluding comments on it, and then we'll plan for next time. So Ognian, are you there?
Just the mic. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So let me start by actually referring to a discussion that we had about on the analytic of the beautiful. A couple of points. First, Joanna said something about the problem of expression and the boundaries that Kant seems to be facing. And then just you referred to Leibniz and how Kant is trying to distance himself from that view of the harmonious universe and perfection and so on. And so if we look at sections 1, like paragraph 1 and paragraph 16 of the analytic of the beautiful, we can see Kant making some jabs at Baumgarten.
Yes.
When he says that the judgment of taste is not a cognitive judgment and it's not a judgment about perfection. And that actually relates to what he says in the introduction, that issue of systematic cognition.
Yes.
The principle of purposiveness is not something that we can actually objectively formulate.
Yes.
And that's why we are kind of surprised, he says in section 5 of the second introduction, that it's a happy accident that we see something purposive. And so we can actually only maybe only experience that harmony in feeling, but not conceptualize it.
Yeah.
So it's in a way, that's a certain type of reduced Leibnizianism maybe.
Yeah.
And so in a way, the world for Kant might be purposive, but we cannot really cognize it. Like nature, it's,
yeah.
I think it's pretty sure that it's not as if purposive, it is purposive, but still we can only feel.
Right.
So this type of issue actually kind of deepens in the analytic of the Sublime.
Okay, interesting.
Which I'm just presently going to. But as you just said, it's an abrupt, actually an abrupt transition, because basically if you look at the entirety of the third critique, Kant, of course, is interested in purposiveness, is in Zuverlässigkeit, but here it seems that nature is precisely not purposive in lots of ways.
Yeah.
It seems to be one of the last sections to be written, I guess, according to that Mito book that you referred to. But yeah, here Kant, a couple of times he uses this expression, Zweckvidrigkeit, which is like they translate it as contra-purposiveness.
Yes, yes, yes.
Not simply non-purposiveness, but contrary to purposiveness. And so we have that expression in 23, in paragraph 27, but also actually in paragraph 67 in the teleology, when he refers to diseases, sorry about that, and like parasites and dreams for some reason. But we can see that in the analytic of the Sublime and in the teleology, he has something to say about how these Zweckvidrige things are actually purposive on some meta level. And so if we, if in the introductions and the sections on the beautiful, Kant is trying to bridge that gap between nature and intellect.
Yes.
Here in the Sublime, we can see how the gap kind of opens up again. And so about structure, here we again have the 4 moments, but they're kind of covered up because Kant divides the Sublime into 2 types.
Yes.
First is mathematical Sublime, second is dynamic Sublime.
Yes.
But here he kind of, he uses the division of the categories from the first critique. We have the first two sets, which are the mathematical categories, and the second two sets, which are the dynamic categories. But here there is also another reason for the systematic division, because Kant says that mathematically sublime relates to cognition, whereas the dynamically sublime relates to desire, to the fact those two fundamental faculties that he refers to in the introduction. So just for quick context, all of you remember that the sublime is like the little, or the brother or the sibling of the beautiful in 18th century aesthetics. Everybody is talking about both categories, and the great predecessor of Kant is Edmund Burke, whom he fleetingly refers to. But I'm just recalling Burke because Kant agrees with him in one important respect and disagrees with him in another respect. So for Burke, this feeling of the sublime is very ambivalent and tense. It's both negative and positive at the same time. Burke says it combines terror with delight, whereas Kant, like more in a more, I guess, down to earth, or anyway, he says like displeasure plus pleasure. So Kant here agrees with that complexity of the feeling, and in a way, Burke is very important because he says the emotion that we relate to the sublime is in a way contrary to that. But what Kant disagrees is that, and it's kind of strange, that he says, well, in the end, it's not nature that is sublime. It's not something that's outside of us. It's the human spirit.
Yeah.
So if Burke says the sublime feeling is a feeling of respect or awe for something that's not comprehensible in nature, or something that's actually supernatural, Kant says that it's a feeling of respect for what's unconditional and supersensible, but it's actually within us.
Yeah.
And so here we can refer to that famous quote from the end of the second critique about the starry heavens and the moral law. And if we read the analytic of the mathematically sublime, it seems that the starry heavens are kind of an image of the moral law.
Yeah.
Perhaps. So let me move to straight on to the mathematically sublime. I guess I'll dwell on that. I'll just say something quick about the dynamically sublime and then make two further points, and I'll be done. So quick definition, he says what's mathematically sublime is absolutely great or absolutely big. And then he says, well, there's no such thing in nature, and only the human spirit can be great beyond comparison. So it's a complicated story. So I won't be unwinding that, but I'll be just saying that here Kant makes a fine point of just presenting the phenomenology of this feeling. In contrast, it's again like a contrast, and at the same time a similarity to the experience of the beautiful. So here we have the imagination, and another faculty that's a faculty for thinking, but with the beautiful we have the understanding, the regular intellect with the regular concept, and here we have reason, which operates with those ideas that we referred to in the beginning. And so here we have the imagination that tries to grasp a natural phenomenon or a natural object, just like the sky or the sea, and it seems this intuition, the view of this object seems to be infinite because the imagination cannot capture it in one image. So Kant makes this disclaimer: we can always logically comprehend the phenomenon by giving it a number, by measuring, but we cannot, so to speak, we cannot visualize it in one image. And so here arises the displeasure. And at the same time, And I guess this arises in page 138 in paragraph 26. This feeling of displeasure, of this Zweckvidrige intuition, this gives rise to the idea of totality, of an entire totality, and the idea of infinity, which Kant argues it's an idea that, and being an idea is not something that can be exhibited into intuition, and it's not something that can, so to speak, inhabit nature. And so we have this kind of tension between us feeling ourselves much smaller than nature in terms of our imagination, and maybe qualitatively huger than nature in being able to think about totality and infinity. And so we have this pleasure, the triumph of reason. And so if you want to look at nice summary, we can look at page 141, but I won't be reading that. Because, yeah, that's paragraph 27. So about the dynamically sublime, it's actually explained more or less in one paragraph, 28. But here we don't have the imagination and reason, more or less, because here desire is involved. We have maybe we can call it the conflict between instinct and freedom, or happiness and dignity. So we have here we have an external force or power that threatens to maybe harm us or destroy us, and then this gives us the feeling, this recalls us of this radical capacity to, which is actually argued about in the second treaty, to act freely based on a principle of our own choice, no matter what the circumstances. So nature in its power can make us feel the true or absolute power which is actually inside us. So again, freedom and reason, which for Kant go together, they try. So I'm kind of wrapping up actually, in the interest of time. I'll just point out some passages. There's one general remark that kind of covers both the analytic of the beautiful and the sublime. Here I'm just pointing out that it's famous for Kant's remarks on enthusiasm. Then beyond those passages in paragraph 49, there is a footnote about the veil of Isis and the sublimity of nature, which is kind of strange. But I want to just to point out the two things that kind of interest me. It's one of them is in the last paragraph 29. It's about culture, and the other goes back to the first paragraph 23, and it's about this technique of nature. So about culture, Kant says this paragraph 29 is about the necessity of the judgment. And as with the beautiful, he says that's a conditional necessity. It's another oxymoron. But here he says it's even more conditional, because we need to have developed those ideas of infinity or freedom in order to experience what's terrible in nature as sublime. And so he says, in fact, without development of moral ideas, what we call sublime would be merely repellent. That's paragraph 29. But also he presses the point that because those ideas need culture to be developed, but they're not a product of culture. They're rooted into human nature. That's kind of interesting that there is a strange historicist moment in Kant's philosophy that kind of gets overlooked, and even refers to like the pure concepts of understanding the first critique. He says they're not innate, they're acquired, and so on. But even with respect to the capacity to act freely, he says it needs to be developed. even though it's not something empirical, it's a priori, but still needs to be developed. So here he says basically the same thing about the ideas that are necessary for the feeling of the sublime. And then just finishing about this technique of nature, if we look at paragraph 23, page 129, he says, I won't be reading those three sentences because they're kind of long, but that's a kind of the passage that starts with the self-sufficient beauty of nature reveals to us a technique of nature which makes it possible, and so on. It's a kind of a systematic thing because it relates his notion of beauty, his notion of the system of nature from the introduction, and his notion of the sublime. And he says here we don't have nature as something ordered. We don't have nature as something technical or artful. I mean, here he uses the word art as just like artifice, not as fine art. But we have nature, and that's a peculiar expression, nature in its chaos or in its wildest and most unruly disorder and devastation. So it's like the complete opposite to what he's talking about in the introductions. And so it's interesting that he kind of goes back to this. On the other hand, this passage is interesting because he kind of goes back to this notion of a technique of nature that's actually absent from the analytic of the beautiful. There's no such thing. It only appears in paragraph 17, I think, but it's very strong in the first introduction, and in the second introduction again.
Yeah.
And it's in the teleology where it remains. But here he decided to keep it. So it's a strange passage. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm all.
Thank you. Yeah, once again, we kind of convey our applause, even if we're not applauding. That's very, very excellent, helpful analysis. We've got the thanks rolling in the chat section. Like I said, I am not prepared today to say too much about the Sublime myself, but perhaps some people have questions for Ognian. Maybe you can formulate questions while I just wanted to make a few comments following up some of what you said, or maybe contextualizing it a bit more historically. The Sublime is, of course, a really weird notion with a weird history. It emerges first in the context of classical rhetoric, right? Figures like Longinus, where the Sublime is an elevated rhetorical mood, I guess you could say. I'm not sure if that's the right technical term. And then it's also
a style, I guess.
Yeah, it's a style. That's one way to put it. And then there's also, of course, this curious, for those of you interested in the history of science, of course, sublimation is also an important term in the history of alchemy slash chemistry, right? Where it's defined as when a solid goes straight to a gas, right? Rather than moving through a liquid phase. And that's how it's defined in modern chemistry. You see it used in peculiar ways throughout the history of alchemy slash chemistry as well. So it has a lot of different senses. And then in modern philosophy, not beginning with Kant, but most famously, I think, with Burke, we start to get an analysis of the Sublime where it is something like, let's say, what happens when you push your experience of the beautiful too far and it crosses over from pleasure into displeasure or something like that. And Burke says some really astounding things. For example, you know, any one of us would happily run out of a theatrical presentation of a murder if we knew that there was a public execution going on outside the theater, right? Because we crave this experience that kind of crosses over into something more intense than kind of business as usual aesthetic delight, even if it's ultimately a form of displeasure. I can also think, just, you know, pursuing this line a bit further, there's a wonderful book from maybe 15 years ago by Richard Klein, who's a professor of French literature, called Cigarettes Are Sublime. That's kind of ultimately about how he quit smoking. But, you know, it's a nice, he gives a nice analysis of this, where it's like, you know, something you think you want, but then no sooner do you indulge in it that it crosses over into this kind of experience of a gaping void. Now, one thing that's significant that Ognian really nicely summarized as we pass from Burke to Kant is that this kind of beholding the gaping void is something that with Kant is now not so much something that you do when you're that you attribute to the world out there. Forget about cigarettes, but think about, say, you know, peering out at the ocean at night, or standing on a mountain precipice or something like that. Ultimately, the sublime experience with Kant, by contrast with Burke, is something that is now kind of inward-looking and internal, right? Having to do with the individual spirit, right? And I think you summarized that very well. Michel Mograbi mentions, not to mention the role of sublimation in psychoanalysis. Absolutely, that's kind of where it goes in its subsequent history. Are there any questions for Ognian before I move on? Thanks again. That's really very helpful. I think next week I might follow up with some further words of my own about the distinction between the mathematical and the dynamical sublimes, and the way that these fit with certain concerns of the first critique. For now, if you will permit me, and if there are no questions for Ognian, what I wanted to do was to loop back before it's too late to the Analytic of the Beautiful, and to highlight just a couple of important elements of it. And that will take, I will only have maybe 8 minutes for that, and then we'll conclude with some planning and administrative questions. All right, let's see. So I finished up with section 8. I wanted to jump much further ahead and look at this long passage in section 16. And also, I mean, I could go back to section 10 and talk about the really nice analysis of purposiveness that we get there. One thing that I failed to mention about purposiveness before, when Whitney was analyzing it, is that this is, I think, more than anything else, the key concept that bridges the two critiques, that is the two halves of the third critique. Purposiveness without purpose is going to be of central importance for the analysis of organized beings. But let me jump ahead to section 16, because I think also here we get a very nice discussion of nature in the critique that's supposed to be about art, right? And as with purposiveness, I'm particularly interested in finding those passages in the critique of teleological judgment that that help us to better understand what the critique of aesthetic judgment and the critique of teleological judgment are doing in the same book, right? And again, it's one of my leitmotifs, and one of the things I just keep harping on, that this is a unified project and we need to understand the nature of this unity. Nowhere do we get a better hint in the first critique than with Kant's notion of free natural beauties, which is a lovely phrase. What is a free natural beauty? Well, he identifies earlier, before he has used the full phrase, two different kinds of beauty, pulchritudo vaga and pulchritudo adherens. And whenever Kant gives Latin in parentheses, I think you should make a note of that. It signals that Kant is, broadly speaking, drawing on tradition. Similarly with purposiveness, when he talks about the forma finalis and the nexus finalis, I don't have time to cover those today, but these are moments where Kant is drawing on his learning to say something new, where he's evoking tradition, even if what he says is new. Similarly here, we have vague pulchritude and adherent pulchritude, if you will. I won't go into the kind of connotations of pulchritudo, but what about free natural beauties? What are these? The examples he gives are things like flowers, where he notes that botanists might understand the function of flowers, namely to attract bees, and thus they play some kind of role in the generative or the life cycle of flowers. What about parrots, hummingbirds, and birds of paradise, and a host of marine crustaceans? That's very interesting, in part because, I mean, it's not clear what he means, but lobsters, as we know from still life paintings, are a kind of classic example of how nature is not necessarily beautiful, but also grotesque. So let's forget about marine crustaceans and focus on parrots and hummingbirds and birds of paradise. They're free natural beauties to the extent that this judgment is not, the judgment that, say, a parrot is beautiful is not grounded on any kind of perfection, any internal purposiveness to which the composition of the manifold is related. And he goes on in this section to talk about this is where he talks about the tattooing of the New Zealanders, which he bemoans, and I think this is interesting for you second critiquers out there. He bemoans this practice because while it might be beautiful, it's beautiful only broadly in the same way that curlicues on wallpaper, foliage for borders on wallpaper is beautiful, but it is lamentable that the canvas for this is a human being, right? Why? Well, because it's taking a human being for a means rather than an end, a means for the representation of delighting patterns, right? I find all of that rather fascinating for reasons that we'll see in the critique of teleological judgment, where Kant turns to the question, like, what is the life of people who live and die in traditional cultural forms 4, that is the unenlightened life, and the examples he gives are South Sea Islanders and Laplanders. And so you should be thinking already about that when Kant signals his not an aesthetic critique of Polynesian tattooing here, but rather a critique on kind of second critique, moral grounds, that it takes a human being as a means rather than an end. Let's see, what else did I want to signal about this this very rich passage? Well, I guess also getting back to the birds of paradise and the hummingbirds, Kant knows enough about botany to know that flowers do have a function. He doesn't seem to be aware of any similar function of attracting mates of beautiful feathers on birds. But obviously, this is such an interesting passage because he's looking at traits of different biological species that emerge under selective pressures. But he is, of course, incapable of cognizing this, of understanding that this is what is at issue. So instead, he's struck with this peculiar kind of power of nature to yield forth beautiful products, even though nature is, on his thinking, not capable of pursuing particular ends, concrete ends, and also is not operating under anything like evolutionary pressures, right? And this is interesting also if you think about these examples, the examples of seashells and so on, in relation both to classical aesthetics, which we've already attributed to Leibniz, and also classical, so to speak, natural philosophy, where, you know, you would, it would have been perfectly kind of meaningful to say that, you know, that nature delights in the production of beautiful forms, right? In fact, people said that kind of thing all the time, right? That nature relishes her beautiful products, and Kant is now working in a vacuum, a historical and conceptual vacuum between the abolition of nature as a kind of generative matrix that delights in her beautiful productions, on the one hand, and nature as operating under Darwinian selection pressures on the other hand, right? And it's within this historical and conceptual vacuum that Kant tries to articulate kind of way of thinking about nature's apparent purposiveness that neither attributes evolution to it nor personifies it as a beautiful, as a beauty-loving goddess. And yes, indeed, Johanna, Melville definitely read Kant. I think, as far as I know, there are a few explicit references to Kant in Moby Dick. But yeah, when Melville says, what does he say? Something, I forget what he says, but yeah, he's commenting on Queequeg's tattooed face, and obviously, yeah, I mean that's a whole fascinating lineage right there. I'm almost out of time, and I have so much more I would like to be able to say today, but rather than do that, just let me, rather than cover any more material, let me just once again thank Whitney and Ognian, and also say quickly, please do let me know if there's any particular material that you're particularly interested in presenting. And I think, I think Whitney in particular, you boldly identified yourself as a non-Kantian, which I really appreciate, because it's a way of proving that that you don't have to be a veteran in order to give a presentation. Next week, I would like to make some concluding comments about the dynamical and the mathematical sublime, and then just pursue further the reading for next time. Are there any concluding questions? It's 2:00 right now. Are there any concluding questions? All right. And by next time, I'll have my cool background image, and it'll be great. All right. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.